Upper extensions. In my 7th chord video, I taught that if you get a triad and you add a third above it, you get a 7th chord. And similar to that idea, if you start adding thirds above your 7th chord, now you get upper extensions. Okay, so to visualize that a lot better, I'm going to take this C major scale you're looking at right here, and I'm going to color code it, and then I'm going to write it out twice, and now I'm going to number them, and now I'm going to build thirds starting from C, so in other words, I'm just going to pick out every other note in the 2 scales that you're looking at. Okay, now I'm just going to number it, and since we're going up thirds, we're counting every other note, so we're going to have odd numbers. Okay, so as you can see, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and 13. I'm going to stop at 13. I'm going to show you why in a second, but first of all, it's really good to understand what we're looking at here. Okay, so I labeled everything Roy G. Biv. In other words, it's the colors of the rainbow, which you might remember from school. So as you can see, I wrote that out here. It's your red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And now something interesting happens when we're adding these upper extensions. So since I labeled every note in the chord a different color of the Roy G. Biv, let's look at what happens when we add these upper extensions up to the 13th. Okay, so as you can see, I have a red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Okay, as you can see, that goes over every color that I labeled my C major scale as, since I just labeled the C major scale that Roy G. Biv. Okay, so before I move on and we start to understand the upper extensions a lot more, let's just kind of look at this a little further, because there's a few points to make here. And one of them is that when you build a triad or a 7th chord, you're just using the notes that are in the scale separated by thirds, so it can sound really nice together. And as you see up here, we have C, E, G, B, so it's nicely separated by those thirds. And what happens when we separate it by thirds is we're not using the notes D, F, and A. But now look what happens when I start adding the upper extensions. So now I get that D, F, and A. So in other words, the exact notes that we do not use when we're building a 7th chord are the exact notes that we use when we're building extensions on top of a 7th chord. And as you might know, if you take a note and you go up or down an octave, it's still going to function as the same note, just a higher or lower pitch of that same note. So for example, when I'm adding my 9, which is my D in this case, that is the same sound as this note, D. It's just a higher pitch version. So because of that, it's gonna function and sound similar to if I just added a D in there. So it's gonna sound similar if I take my 9, which is my D, and instead I do the D down here, which would be my 2. So as you can see, obviously not the same exact sound, but it is similar. And it's good to understand that when we're building these upper extensions up to 13, that we are including all of the notes that are in the scale. Okay, so it is logical to stop at 13, because when you add that 15th, all that you're doing is adding the same note that you started from. So I started on C, and now I'm ending on C 2 octaves up. Upper extensions can be called by their name, so 9, 11, and 13, and they can also be called what compound interval they are. I'm going to explain this. So I could call it a 2, 4, and a 6. So I could call it a compound major 2nd, a compound perfect 4th, and a compound major 6th. An easy way to remember what upper extension interval you have is using the number 7. 7 minus your upper extension is the compound interval that you are working with. So if I add this 9th on top of my 7th, then I can do 9 minus 7, which is 2. So that tells me that my 9 is also a compound 2nd. And specifically, it is a compound major 2nd, and I'm going to go over why it's a compound major 2nd. That part is actually pretty simple. And just to go over again why it's called a compound major 2nd, that's because I have this note D, which is my 9th, but that is the same exact note as D, my 2nd. It's just a higher up version. So because it's a higher up version, it's not a 2nd, it's a compound 2nd. So when an interval is compound, what it means is that it has a whole octave below it and then that interval. So just to look at that, I'm going from C to D. So as you can see, there's that whole octave difference between the D that's right next to the C and the D that I'm using as my 9 when I'm making that 9 chord. Okay, so your upper extension remains the same quality of interval. So if I'm doing a compound major second, let's first look at a major second. Okay, that's the note C and D. And now if I take my 7th chord and I add that D on top of it, I can think of this as a compound major second. It's still the note D, it's still a major second, but it is an octave higher than the note originally found in the scale, so therefore it is a compound major second. Okay, so now we know a compound major second is the same thing as a major ninth, but this also works for perfect intervals. So if I had a compound perfect fourth, that would be the same thing as a perfect 11th. Okay, so I'm going to break that down a little bit. So normally if we have a perfect fourth, we're going to have the notes C and F if we're starting from C. So now if I have this 7th chord and I want to add that compound perfect fourth on top of it, that could be thought of as a perfect 11th and can also be thought of as a compound perfect fourth. All of your upper extensions are diatonic, meaning that they're using the notes in the scale that you're using. So in this instance, we're using the C major scale. So all of my upper extensions in their regular form are going to use these notes in the scale. Furthermore, a major 9 chord does not mean that we're using a major 9. What it actually means is that we're using a major 7th with a diatonic 9th on top of it. Okay, so now if you're wondering, wait, a second ago I was just saying that this is a major 9th because it's using the same interval as the major second. And yes, that is 100% correct. The only thing is that when we're looking at this C major 9 chord, all that I'm saying is that when it's saying C major 9, that means we have a C major 7 with a 9 on top of it. And since it's always diatonic with these upper extensions, it's a diatonic 9. But most of the time, people just think of them as the number. So like here we have a 9, then a sharp or flat symbol will tell them to play it up or down a semitone to achieve the desired sound the player wants. So we have that 9, we could do like a flat 9, we could also do a sharp 9. So it's really good just to understand this so we can understand what's going on in terms of pitch here and in terms of function of these pitches. If you're a little bit confused right now, it's going to get cleared up in a little bit, so just follow along and things are going to start making some more sense. Okay, so since all intervals in a major scale compared to the root note are either major or perfect, we automatically know that the upper extensions in their default with no accidentals are always either major or perfect when you're comparing them to that root note. Okay, so I'm looking at this root note in the C major scale, so I'm looking at C, and I'm going to build all the intervals made of all the notes in the scale, and you're going to see something. And that is that I have a major second, a major third, a perfect fourth, a perfect fifth, a major sixth, a major seventh, and a perfect octave. So as you can see, starting from that root note, everything is either major or perfect. So that means if I make a chord starting from C, so let's say I do a C major 7 chord, that means if I add my diatonic upper extensions, I know they're either going to be major or perfect. So in this case, I have a compound major second, a compound perfect fourth, and a compound major sixth. So now I know we're only talking about odd numbers, but just to understand these upper extensions a little more, that is that when I'm looking at the context of C, 9 and 10 are both going to be compound major intervals, because 9 and 10 is the same thing. Remember, if you do that -7 as a second and a third. And since both of these are major, when they turn into their compound interval, they remain major. Then 11 and 12 are perfect compound intervals because it's using the same notes as the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth, just a higher pitch version. Then my 13th and my 14th are going to be major because they're just using the same notes as my major sixth and my major seventh. Now if I have my 15, that is perfect because my 15 is a compound perfect octave. So it's using the same note as if I just had an octave, but one octave higher than that. Okay, now everything I just showed you about the major and perfect intervals in comparison to that C note only work when you're looking at this note C. When you look at D, all of a sudden you run into something. Okay, we have a major second, and then we have a minor third, and as we go so on, we then get another minor interval. If we go up to E, you start to see that then we actually start to get a lot of minor intervals, so the functions start to kind of change there. but it's good to comprehend this. So every note in the scale is going to give us a different result, and because of this, it is better just to call the extension by its number, 9, 11, or 13. So learning that information about the major and the perfect intervals in comparison to that root note, that's just helping us understand upper extensions more, because now we can comprehend the fact that when we are going to different notes in the scale, that's not always the case. So we're going to have some different functions because of that. Popular sheet music sometimes shows chord symbols using the numbers 2, 4, and 6 to label the same extensions that you would as 9, 11, or 13. This is because this is generally considered easier for the musician to read. It is good to know that both 9, 11, and 13 and 2, 4, and 6 can refer to the same extensions. It is more common that upper extensions are referred to by their numbers that exceed the number 8 or the octave, so 9, 11, and 13. In other words, the numbers that are greater than the numbers which identify the chord tones. So you have your 1, 3, 5, and 7, and when you go above that, you're still going up your odd numbers, so you get your 9, 11, and 13. So you have your 1, 3, 5, and 7, and since you're going up odd numbers, then you have your 9, 11, and 13. And that makes a lot of sense because you're just continually going up those odd numbers, those thirds. So that is the more common way to notate it. So typically when you're dealing with upper extensions, your lower 4 notes that can be found in the chord, your 1, 3, 5, and 7, are thought to be your chordal tones. While the upper 3 notes, the 9, 11, and 13, are known as upper extensions or can just be thought of as extensions. Jazz players often use upper extensions for adding more color to their music. Sometimes upper extensions are just added on top of single chords for more color. So you might add a 9 on top of your 7th chord to make it sound a little more full. And sometimes upper extensions are used to make more colorful chord progressions and resolutions, as well as more colorful harmonies. Okay, so that's basically it for this video. Upper extensions. The only other thing that I want to talk about is this little extra note that I have in this bold square here. And I saved this for the last because I kind of think of this more like an extra note. It doesn't exactly fit exactly like all the other notes in this video do. It can be thought of as slightly off topic, but it does correlate with a lot of the things that I added in this video, and it's just something good to keep in mind. So remember I was saying that it makes sense to stop at 15 since 15 is your compound octave, which in other words is just using that same note as your starting note, ending up in the same place that you started. But what happens if I want to go from that 15 and I want to build above that? So I want a 17, I want a 19th, I want a 21st, okay? So there's no one telling you that you can't do that. There's just something to consider that, especially for someone trying to read that and play that, that is not a very generic way to notate that. So if someone was reading that and they wanted to play it, they probably would be confused and not trained on how to do that because that is not something you typically see. So there are more conventional approaches to this. This is known as the quindecesima, notated as 15 MA. This means that you play the note or the notes that are notated 2 octaves higher than what you're seeing written. There's also a quindecesima bassa, which is notated as 15 MB. This means that you play the note or the notes 2 octaves lower than what you see as written. Okay, so let's say written down you saw the note C, and then after that you saw the note E, just like this, but instead there is a quindecesima written next to it. So that would be communicating with you or the player that you're not going to be playing the next E 1 octave up, you're going to be playing 2 octaves up. So the next E. And as you can imagine, that'll be a lot easier for the player to read, saying, okay, I'm just going to play the note E 2 octaves up on my instrument. Okay, now this just leads to the topic of an ottava line notated as 8VA. This means you play the note or notes 1 octave higher than what is written. There's also an ottava bassa notated as 8VB. This means you play the note or notes 1 octave lower than what is written. This is an entirely different topic than upper extensions of chords or chord extensions, but it's something that is good to know. Thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up so other people can also learn from this. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. I'm going to be posting a video like this at least once a week. I'm slowly building up to the whole concept of composing, so at some point I'm just going to be showing you composing, and these videos are going to help you comprehend what's going on there. Until next time, have a good one.